Welcome back. Okay, did anybody really expect to get a distant counter seal, let alone it being locked to dragon units? Honestly, I'm all for this. If it means we could get more of these types of seals in the future, I'm absolutely down. But for now, I just want to talk about this distant counter seal because I do think it's really, really cool, and it actually buffs dragons in quite a lot of ways. Granted, not all of them, but a good amount. Likewise, I also want to give some insight and potentially give out some sort of guidance for people looking to use this sacred seal, because why not? You don't really have to upgrade it, you just get it if you get to the points, and at worst if you miss it in the Tempest trial, you could just get it for a few amount of sacred coins. But nevertheless, I want to give my thoughts on it in general, and I do think that it will be really cool to see this going forward, as there are a lot of things you can do with it, surprisingly. But enough of the intro, we may as well just get right into it. Let's talk about the distant counter sacred seal for dragons. Having a distant counter seal for dragons is not only really good just so you can have distant counter on any dragon you really want. Granted, they already had lightning breath, but now you just have to slap a seal and you don't even have a penalty to it. Now you can just run all sorts of ace skills that normally you really couldn't do on the sacred seal, such as Svallin shield for armors, unities, tier 4 stances, tier 4 bonds, and ideals. These are notable skills that you can actually run on your A slot now, which is really nice because outside of distant counter, there aren't any 300 SP sacred seals, let alone any tier 4 skills. So having the ability to run tier 4 skills in your A slot with a distant counter skill in your sacred seal means that you actually do end up benefiting a lot more as opposed to distant counter in the A slot and some other sacred seal in the S slot. However, there is always going to be an opportunity cost. For example, one of the biggest things you will lose out on if you run distant counter in the sacred seal is Deflect, because Deflect isn't replicable by any sort of skill at the moment, let alone the A slot. So for going up against units with brave attacks, for example, or desperation of some sort, you will end up taking a lot more damage in retaliation as opposed to running a distant counter A slot and then deflecting the seal. However, that's mainly going to come into play for competitive modes such as Summoner Duels or Aether Raids, so you don't really have to worry about it as much in maybe PvE. Maybe on the occasion with units that release with brave effects, but outside of that, you don't really have to worry about it too much. However, outside of the deflect seals, you do lose out on other combinations. So for example, we do have higher tier distant counter skills such as Distant Stance, Distant Storm, etc, etc. So if your unit does rely on an effect such as Steady Breath or anything of the sort, and you typically run that in your Sacred Seal, then running Distant Counter as your Sacred Seal is probably less efficient than running a Breath and then a Distant Counter skill in the A slot where you can get additional stats. That being said, you could always run an ally that provides some sort of breath support, so you don't lose out on the effect, but nevertheless, it does come at an opportunity cost because you still have to run an ally for that. So there is trade-offs for running this Sacred Seal. But outside of that, you do lose out on the B slot and C slot Sacred Seal options. And granted, most of these are support-oriented, but there are notable exceptions such as Quick Riposte and Mystic Boost. However, those are few and far between, so it's not as bad of a trade-off as the other opportunity costs would provide. But nevertheless, having Distant Counter for dragons as a Sacred Seal is really cool. So I want to go over some units and some interesting builds that could potentially go over really well with this Sacred Seal. So starting us off, we have Fallen Rhea, who arguably probably makes one of the best users of this, simply because of the fact that she can now run Svallin shield in her A slot, meaning that she doesn't have to worry about armor effectiveness, which is really, really, really good. She does have her dragon weakness, but that's expected for most dragons, not named Garen or Sothis, but even with that being the case, this does kind of turn her into a brave Hector of sorts, which is really interesting, to say the least, because with Ruinous Frost, her damage output is really, really significant, and with True Dragon Wall, she is going to be tanking quite a bit, as well as healing if she meets a condition, which is really, really easy to do. So you can actually make her into a Brave Hector counterpart of sorts. Granted, maybe not complete power creep, and maybe this does kind of shadow nerf Brave Hector in some capacity because now it's not the only thing he can do. But nevertheless, it is definitely worth considering. If you can remove her armor weakness, that is a great feat that you can do. especially since Svallin Shield currently isn't a Sacred Seal, and if they do ever make that a Sacred Seal in the future, then switching out Svallin Shield in the A slot for maybe Distant Stance will be a bit better because you get extra stats. Another notable option is Ascended Idun, because she's already a Brave Hector counterpart. She basically has the same weapon minus the guaranteed follow-up from the weapon. But even with that being the case, she could still run Distant Counter and a Sacred Seal, and then run a stance, her innate stance for example. So she can inflict guard on the foe. So she's getting additional effects that her A slot can provide that she couldn't do otherwise, because prior to not having the Distant Counter slot, you needed that for the A slot. And the Sacred Seal doesn't provide any sort of compromise for Sturdy Stance 3. So having the ability to inflict guard on the foe is really cheeky in a sense, actually, because it's going to be really, really difficult just to get damage on her in general, which is going to be really nice. And outside of that, you also have Legendary Myr, who makes a really good candidate because she has her guaranteed follow-up and damage reduction properties built into her weapon and B slot respectively. So having the ability to run Distant Counter in her Sacred Seal while not being able to give up stuff like Defense Res Unity means that she can still tank quite well. And even though she will have to worry about bows to an extent, if they have Deadeye or like some Brave effect or whatever the case may be, it won't be as prominent because she does have her damage reduction properties and the guaranteed follow-up. So she doesn't have to worry as much as maybe OG Myr or Spring Myr, because they don't have as many effects. So being able to function in both phases, because this does work in the player phase as well, Godly Breath, does actually give her a lot more flexibility in her combat, which is really nice. Other notable candidates include Medius, who is already a big nuisance in general if you just play Aether Raids, or maybe you've run into him in Arena or Arena Assault, whatever the case may be. He's a nuisance because he has an absurd amount of damage reduction as well as guaranteed follow-ups. He's annoying. He's really annoying. So slapping Distant Counter in his Sacred Seal so he could still keep his base kit, he's going to be really, really annoying to deal with. More so now than he was before. You also have Nagi, who already has Distant Counter in her base kit, but similar to Idun, you can run her with a tier 4 stance, which will inflict guard, which is really good. And because Distant Counter in the Sacred Seal is an option now, you can still run Hardy Fighter, Far Save, and even though she does lose out on the guaranteed follow-up, which does kind of suck, she does have a lot of effects going on in her PRF to make her one of the more formidable armors to deal with, especially since you can't area of effect her, because she just reduces that by 80%. It's really, really strong. And beyond that, you also have Halloween Rhea, who has a guaranteed follow-up in her weapon. She prevents follow-ups. She can run Dragon Wall, Distant Counter, again, keep her Unity, Joint Drive Attack. She's got the works. She's pretty good with that. And I would say these are the most notable candidates. There are other ones that come to mind for sure. Now, I'll be going over a lot of dragons anyway, as you'll see in a second. But as far as like the top dragons go, in my opinion, these are probably some of the better ones you could run with the Distant Counter Sacred Seal, because they benefit so much from it. But you also have other interesting users of it, such as the Adrift Corins, who have Slang, Breath in their weapon, a bunch of stats. They got the works. Oh, and damage reduction. How can I forget that part? So they can run no follow-up damage reduction. They don't need breath support, which is really, really good. And then they can stack Unity and the Distant Counter Seal. So they're basically going to be a big menace in general. Unless you have some sort of Deadeye effect, or you could just pierce through it, I would not count on initiating on this thing. But you also have other armors such as Halloween Grima, who can still run the same Svallin Shield, yada yada yada, but his PRF Moonstrike Breath does keep his sustainability really high because he heals every time his special triggers. So every time the foe initiates combat, as long as they don't have a guard effect, he will retaliate with a special if the special is 2 cooldown or it's 3 cooldown and he has breath support. But nevertheless, with the Distant Counter Seal and Sturdy Stance, he'll be able to not only tank quite a bit, but also sustain quite well, and output 2 attacks because he has Fighter in his B slot, which is really nice. Although for general tanking that isn't an armor, you have Maelkana, who is a big stat ball overall. One of the things I did mention before is that if you can run it in your Sacred Seal, you're better off taking a different Distant Counter skill, if you can afford it, of course, as you'll get more stats that way. However, with Male Kana, for example, if you run something like Defense Res Ideal 4 and then the Distant Counter Seal, you're getting more stats than you would with a Distant Stance and then maybe a solo. You end up with a more even distribution, which is really good. So for general tanking and stat balling nature, I would definitely recommend Male Kana. He's quite good with this, honestly. And similar to Kana, you have Garen, who has to rely on Dragon's Ire, but he has Guard and 10 attack defense res from his weapon. But he also has this other effect that works on like one of the turns, and that's whatever for the most part. But even with that being the case, he's pretty min-maxed for the most part, and because he has access to Dragon's Ire, he doesn't really have to worry about doubling as much unless there is a null follow-up effect. But even with that being the case, with the Distant Counter Seal, he'll still act similar to Kana, where he is a bit more susceptible, but he will be a bit more tanky as a result because of the guard effect, as well as the additional +2 he gets to his attack, defense, and res. And then this one is definitely interesting. I don't know if I necessarily recommend it, but you have it ready to go if you just own a Summer Niffle. Summer Niffle, as long as she's within 2 spaces of an ally, she will have the null follow-up effect, and because her PRFC grants damage reduction on the first hit, she can actually work in the enemy phase. You can actually make her dual phase in some sort if you keep her with Trace. So she initiates combat, she retreats back to an ally within 2 spaces, and then she takes a hit in the enemy phase. You will lose out on healing, but you can always bring a healer for that, or you can run Noontime, or whatever the case may be. But nevertheless, it is something worth considering. Even if it's not necessarily the most optimal, it is really cool. And in a similar vein, you have Muspel, who is only really good to hit once because he doesn't have speed unless you run Dragon's Ire. But in my opinion, you're better off running Dragon's Wrath with Domain of Flame, so he could just aim for one-shots. With Domain of Flame and Dragon's Wrath, he's going to be outputting a really high amount of damage, which is incredibly good. So with the Distant Counter Seal in tow, as well as a Unity, for example, so he can bolster his overall attack. You could keep his Dragon Wall if you really want to, if you don't have Dragon's Wrath. So the extra res he gains from Unity can help with general tanking, which is good. So for what it's worth, I would definitely say that Muspel is pretty good if you really just want to aim for one-shots. However, I also do recommend that you bring some sort of breath support so that he could get Noontime off really consistently. And that's pretty much it in terms of like the interesting cases. Next, I want to move on to scoring, because this is our first 300 SP Sacred Seal. So there are 2 dragons in the game that now score the highest in the game, that being Ascended Dune and Halloween Sothis. With the newly released 300 SP Seal as well as the B slot, Ascended Dune and Halloween Sothis can actually reach a bit more above their bins, so they can actually reach stuff like Duochrome, which is really cool. Granted, you will have to double dip on the Distant Counter with Halloween Sothis, but that's a price you gotta pay for Arena. So if you want to do that, great. Otherwise, I don't really recommend it. Not at all. Arena's not really worth investing to in the long run, unless you want the crowns, and that's something you kind of want to do for endgame, but for return investment, I would not recommend it. But nevertheless, it was cool to bring up. Next, we can move on to units that don't really need the Distant Counter Sacred Seal, because they do have competitive enough PRFs that can allow them to keep it. And that's mainly going to be Noe and Legendary Tiki. I know Noe was one of the ones that was kind of memed around when it came to the Distant Counter Sacred Seal coming out, because she has a Distant Counter PRF and it's just Spectrum 4 with Slick, and that's about it. But nevertheless, I don't find it to be the worst thing in the world, mainly because you are giving up additional stats in your Sacred Seal or additional effects for the Distant Counter Sacred Seal. So having Distant Counter built into your weapon with an additional effect or 2 means that units like Noe and Legendary Tiki can continue to stack their overall stats, which isn't bad whatsoever. So for Noe, she can run Bonus Tumbler, for example, and get a potential up to Spectrum 6 if she has +6 to everything, visibly. That's not bad whatsoever. You do also have to keep in mind that in terms of inheritable Dragon Stones, we don't actually have as many competitive ones, or ones that provide enough effects that justify replacing the PRF that has Distant Counter in it for something else. But nevertheless, there are units that do fall into that category. And then just to highlight Legendary Tiki real quick, she basically debuffs attack, has Distant Counter, whatever. She also has the Spectrum 4, It's good because it does provide a good amount of stats. So you basically just can continue to make her into a far save tank, and that's pretty good. Outside of that, there are 2 units that I would recommend replacing their distant counter PRFs with, and that's Sothis and Svallin Tiki. And this mainly falls in line with the fact that they don't have refines, and to be fair, they are due for refines sooner or later. Sothis is on the remix train right now, and Svallin Tiki is due sooner or later because we just got Rakud and Marita, and she was on the same banner, so they are due for refunds. So whether or not you want to give them another weapon is entirely up to you, because you could easily just wait it out and you don't have to run the distant counter Sacred Seal. This is just mainly something here if you want to try it on these units and you don't want to wait for the refund, because there's nothing inherently wrong with either, but nevertheless, their PRFs are pretty much just distant counter with either Dragon Effectiveness Nullification or Dragon Effectiveness, both of which aren't really amazing. So again, I would either just replace it for Lantern Breath or Blackfire Breath, or just wait for a refund, because right now they really shouldn't be using their PRFs at all. In any case though, there are some units that would actually benefit from using the other distant counter skills, such as Duma and the Mercs. So I did bring up earlier that we do have higher tier distant counter skills, so it's not entirely power creep, it's not entirely you should just use the distant counter seal, because you do lose out on some stats comparatively. So for example, Duma can actually make for a decent Vantage unit because he does get additional attack from his weapon, he has that Dragon's Wrath effect. Duma's not a bad Vantage unit per se. I wouldn't really run him with like Bullet Fighter. If you really want him to have that player phase, you can, but I don't think it's that reliable, but nevertheless, the fact that he can potentially set up into Vantage because he has a damage reduction, but he also has a Domain of Flame effect built into him, he could actually aim for one-shots, which is pretty good. So in Duma's case, you could run Distant Storm with Fierce Stance 3, and he ends up getting more attack than he would from a Distant Counter Seal and any sort of A-slot, because there's no A-slot in the game that provides at least 11 attack. He would actually benefit from just running Distant Storm. However, for budget purposes, there isn't anything wrong with just running the Distant Counter Sacred Seal, because you could still run Fierce Stance or whatever the case may be, and he should still be hitting quite hard nevertheless. You also have the original Mert, where you can run the Distant Counter Sacred Seal. However, given that units are just hitting way harder nowadays, in fact, she doesn't have as many effects as maybe her Legendary or even her Spring variant. She only has the Follow-Up Prevention and the half no follow-up effect with stats. You're better off just keeping Iote's Shield, because you don't want her getting taken down by any sort of bow. And the thing is that running Iote's Shield in the A slot is going to be significantly weaker than just running it in the seal, because you could run something like Distant Sand to get extra stats. And the same thing does apply to Spring Mer. She does have damage reduction, which is a bit better for sure. However, she does also face similar issues with the likes of damage reduction nullification. So even with the extra stats and the damage reduction properties, I would still argue that you're better off just keeping Iote's Shield and then running Distant Stance or any sort of distant counter skill. Even the one she comes with, it's just the original distant counter, because I don't feel confident that she can take a Deadeye or anything from a bow if they are able to double. And her damage output, while decent, isn't exactly anything impressive. So I would still take Iote's Shield in the Sacred Seal over Distant Counter. And that's about it for the Distant Counter Sacred Seal. Overall, I am really happy with this inclusion. I think this is going to be really, really cool. It is really going to benefit the really good dragons, obviously, but it is going to open up a lot more for other dragons, which is really nice. Nevertheless, let me know what your thoughts are down below. What dragon are you really going to be using this on? Do you even use dragons? Do you want to see any sort of different distant counter skill? Maybe like distant counter sword, or even like a close counter variant, like close counter tome or dagger, whatever the case may be. I want to know your thoughts. This has been my analysis guide thingy-majiggy on the distant counter seal for dragons. If you like this video and you want to see more of these, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know I did a good job. You don't have to do that, but yeah, just show your support of some kind. And until next time, I'll see you later.